Well, hello there, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started here now. We're at noon Eastern time here, so hopefully everyone's had time to at least grab some lunch and get logged into the webinar here today. Well, first off, I want to welcome you all to today's webinar regarding the Journey to the Clouds Masterclass on Cloud Migration, a panel discussion. My name is Andy Serwich from Altera Software, and I'm joined today by two good friends of mine. I've got Thomas Maurer and Didier Van Hoy. How's it going, gents?
Just fine, thank you.
Great, as always.
Good, good. Well, hey, I want to first say thank you guys for coming on the webinar today and sharing your insights and some of the real world scenarios that you've been through. And really, it's great to have you guys here. And as always, great to talk to you guys about tech. So thanks for being on the show today.
You're welcome.
So what I want to do is I want to start with kind of our agenda for the day. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to cover some introductions of myself, Thomas, Didier, Altero, who's the sponsor of today's webinar. And then really we're going to get into, what you're here to listen to today. So we're doing a panel style webinar today where it's more of a discussion between Thomas, Didier, and myself and you, the attendees. You can feel free to use the questions form and go to webinar to go ahead and not only ask your questions, but if you want to add in a tidbit of your opinion or just a thought or whatever, this webinar is about you as well. So as we have time, we'll be sure to get your opinions and your questions added into the show and addressed if possible. And another thing, if time permitting, we'll try to handle everything. If we can't, though, we always do a follow-up blog post on the Altero Hyper-V blog that contains not only a full list of the questions, but also their associated answers. So we'll be sure to get that out to you afterwards if for some reason we can't handle all the questions. So, but back to the content of this webinar, I think over the last couple of months, a pretty common theme has been coming up, at least in my circles lately, and that has to do with cloud. And the fact that, hey, we have all these great tools out there. We've got all these tools for hosting private clouds and hybrid clouds, and we've got the full public cloud out there that's available for us to use. But the one question that seems to keep coming up is, how do I get there? How do I utilize those features? And the thought behind this whole webinar is how to get there. How can you take that journey to the clouds and make a meaningful impact inside of your environments, inside your businesses, and just make an impact using those technologies that are out there. So the way that we've structured the agenda today is first we're going to start with more of the things on the private cloud side, using some of the technologies in Windows Server 2016, Windows Server 2019, which currently is in technical preview, and the whole concept that Microsoft has of the software-defined data center. We're going to be starting on that side. And then we'll work through some management stuff with Windows Admin Center, or if you excuse me, if you haven't been following the news recently, Windows Admin Center was recently called Project Honolulu. You may know it by that name as well. And then from there, we're going to get into more of the hybrid route, bringing Azure into your data center using Azure Stack. And then from there, we'll talk about kind of dipping your toe into the public cloud space using Azure IaaS. So from there, we'll have a final Q&A. But again, like I said, feel free to ask questions, make comments in the questions form as we go through the webinar today. And then again, we'll have that final Q&A towards the end of the session today. So with that, we'll again do some introductions. Again, my name is Andy Serwich. I am a technical evangelist with Altera Software, the sponsor of today's webinar. I'm also a Microsoft MVP in the Cloud and Data Center Management competency. I've been in the industry for 14, 15 years now. And my focus has always been on infrastructure, from the Windows server stack to VMware, Hyper-V, storage, networking. I've always been in infrastructure. Lately, I've been describing myself as a recovering server hugger because I've kind of been going through this journey myself as well. Like I said, I've been hugging servers for the last 15 years or so, and I'm just now starting to, work into the new cloud technologies that are out there, and I'm learning to let go of that server infrastructure a little bit. So this conversation has been very relevant to, what I've been dealing with here the last couple of weeks and months here. So I will hand it over to Didier now, so he can do his own introduction. Take it away, my friend.
Yeah, so I work as a Microsoft infrastructure architect, and that means, of course, I mainly focus on Microsoft and technologies, and especially storage technologies, anything that has to do with high availability, and that actually includes networking, so the entire stack that to make that happen. I sleep very comfortable in the cloud while hugging my server, basically. Yeah.
There you go. There you go. Thanks, Didier. Next, I'll hand it over to Thomas for his introduction.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, my name is Thomas Maurer. I work as a lead architect at ITnetics, and I focused a long time from infrastructure, Hyper-V, virtualization, storage, and building clouds for service providers. I'm now, in the recent years, working more and more with Azure and Azure Stack and help customers on their cloud journey and how they can get there, basically.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Now, a quick word about the sponsor of the show, an introduction to Altero Software, the company I work for. So we're a fast-growing developer of some super awesome, fantastic, easy-to-use backup software designed specifically for the SMB and the mid-market and for service providers that are operating in that space as well. That virtual backup solution is trusted by 40,000 plus customers, 7,000 plus partners and MSPs worldwide, and that is Altero VM Backup. If you're interested in that product, you can go ahead and take a look at altero.com/vm-backup for more information. And with that, we'll go ahead and talk about today's format. So again, today is a panel style webinar. So, it's all about discussion. There are no right or wrong answers. And, the guys and I, we've been talking today and previously that, with all these different options in the cloud and hybrid cloud and private on-prem cloud, there's so many options. There really are no right or wrong answers. So, be sure to, like I said, be sure to provide your opinion, be sure to ask questions, and we'll do what we can to get you involved in the webinar today. So with that, we will move on to our first talking point, and that is Windows Server 2019 and the software-defined data center. So like I said earlier, we're kind of starting on the private cloud side of things, because I know a lot of IT guys today are still, kind of in that on-premises space where they have Windows Server on site. They're using it to host up services to their local networks, and they're starting to dip their toe into this whole concept of cloud, right? And I wanted to start with Windows Server 2019 because really, even in 2016, there were a lot of enhancements and breakthroughs in technology that really enable that platform for private cloud hosting. And we're definitely seeing a lot more of that now in the 2019 technical preview as well. So really what I wanted to do with each major talking point here, each major section, is first say, who is this technology for? Where does it fit? And end each section with kind of answering, how do IT pros get there? So as we talk through each section here, we're gonna try and make sure we cover both of those points, because again, this is about getting you to the cloud in some way, shape, or form, right? So I guess I'll pick on myself and I'll start with this one. So when it comes to Windows Server 2019 and the software-defined data center, I see this technology as really being for everyone. Whether you're using the public cloud today, or whether you're using on-premises, Windows Server 2019 it's really there to enable cloud capabilities for everyone. If you're running Windows Server 2012, 2012 R2, 2016, you'll be able to upgrade to this and take advantage of a lot of the enhancements that they have baked into it today. So, really, like I said, I see this as being for everyone. Now, gents, Thomas, Didier, I don't know if you guys want to weigh in on that, provide a little bit information, your thoughts, opinions. Whoever wants to start can go for it.
Thomas?
All right. So yeah, I totally agree. This is really the technology. A lot of customers or a lot of people have one touch point with Windows Server, right? Some of them are running it as a hypervisor, some of them running it as an application host, and even if we move to the cloud and we used it for as virtualization host or storage host, we still will see Windows Server everywhere, right? So Microsoft uses it as a foundation for their Azure cloud as well as for Azure Stack. And that gives us also some, whatever Microsoft does with it, and Azure as one of the biggest or largest customers of Windows Server, want some new features and need some new stuff, and we will also get that in the latest releases for our on-prem environments. On the other hand, Microsoft is investing heavily, I think, in Windows Server as an application platforms. There are, I guess, millions of applications out there which today leverage Windows Server and as a platform, and together, like bringing new features and bringing containers and enhancing containers to that platform, I think that really helps and makes an impact for everyone out there.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair and correct assessment. What I would like to say to the attendees is like, even the cloud journey, there is no shame in having an on-premise presence. I mean, there is, as Thomas said, a tremendous amount of applications that are legacy, but legacy doesn't have to mean bad. They contribute valuable stuff to the companies. They make a profit. They are needed to run the company. So you have to take care of them as well. And going to the cloud doesn't mean that you have to take everything you have and bring it into the cloud. You just have to make sure cloud becomes part of your strategy. And as part of that strategy, you cannot just abandon what you have, which is needed today to run the company, and leave it at that. So my advice is, if you have a need for on-premises services, that's fine, and treat them well. Keep them up to date. Make sure that they don't become a blocker to your cloud plans, to your future plans. Be proud of that legacy, because that's what brought your organizations where they are today. And just take it along in the journey. That might mean it shrinks or that workloads change, but that's going to take a while. And applications tend to have a long tail. So this isn't over yet for, let's say, the server. And don't forget, you use servers on premises, but you also use servers in the cloud. Sometimes you consume them directly as an operating system in infrastructure as a service. So there is a lot of, let's say, a rush to get to the cloud. That's fine. Go there as fast and as good as you can, but take care of what you have now and make sure you keep that up to date as well. Don't abandon it, because that will become technology debt, and that will be very costly to fix. So
yeah, definitely. You know, we did another session of this webinar earlier today, and you brought up a good point, Didier, in that session earlier today. We were talking about technology debt, actually, and the fact that, you know, the cloud is enabling us to do all this amazing stuff, right? But it's also forcing organizations to keep up with new technology a little bit more than they were before, and kind of help prevent that whole idea of technology debt, correct?
yep.
So I think that was some interesting insight that I wanted to share as well. So yeah. So let's move on to the next bullet point here, and that is specifically about storage in Windows Server 2019. So, you know, in Windows Server 2012 R2, 2016, we've had a lot of great enhancements in, you know, the whole concept of hyperconverged infrastructure in the Microsoft stack with Storage Spaces Direct. Now, Didier, I know that you're a big storage guy. You want to cover this particular bullet point a little bit with us?
Storage Spaces Direct, I think you owe it to yourself to take a look at it. It's one of the better hyperconverged solutions there on the market. The performance is extraordinary. Does it mean that it will replace every type of storage everywhere in the world? Probably not. I'm not convinced of that. I'm convinced that various types of storage still have a role. But the hyperconverged model by itself holds a lot of value, certainly in specific virtualization roles. So, and that's for a lot of companies a majority of the storage consumption. So do look at it and think about this. Microsoft needs it as well for their own purpose. They need it in Azure. They need it for Azure Stack. This is not just some small subset of what Microsoft is doing in the margin of everything that's happening. It's a core, essential part of their strategy in the long term. And it's matured a lot, and it's maturing even better in, let's say, in 2019. So if you've looked at it and you said, no, it's not for us, you might reconsider in the future and take a look again, because it does hold value. And I don't just think about it as a Windows box that does some storage. It's a bit more advanced than you might think.
Right, yeah, definitely. You know, I think the thing with Storage Spaces Direct was historically, a lot of people had a bit of a hang up when it came to the management of it, correct? But and we're going to talk about management here a little bit in the next section. But I know that with 2019 and with 2016, Microsoft has taken a lot of strides to improve the management story around storage spaces direct. Like for example, I know with the current instance of the 2019 technical preview, they recently added the ability to get performance history of storage spaces direct through Windows Admin Center, which is always important, right?
Which is also normal. You develop a
Right.
technology and it has to mature and grow. I remember the days when you couldn't get that information out of a SAN easily. You had to have the vendor come in and take it out of the controllers.
Right.
So you cannot expect a mature product with 10 years of history and feature complete within 1 year or 2 years. It's going to take a bit more time, but they're getting there and they're evolving, just like their competitor did with vSAN. It wasn't the perfect product from day one either.
Yep, definitely. Well, let's the other area here that when I'm talking about Server 2019 and Microsoft in general lately is containers. Now, containers, Docker, Kubernetes, I mean, those are all huge buzzwords in the industry right now, right? And so I want to take a little bit of time and kind of touch base on that. And the fact that Windows containers have become such a big focus of the Microsoft ecosystem. So, you know, if you are attendees, if you're frequent Altera webinar attendees, you'll know that our last webinar back in May, I think, we did an AMA style webinar with Ben Armstrong from the Hyper-V team. Now, instead of Microsoft, the Hyper-V team owns containers on the Windows platform. So we had a great webinar there with Ben Armstrong. And one of the things that he said during that webinar that really kind of struck me was centered around use case. You know, we had a question from an attendee that was basically, you know, hey, what kind of workloads should I be putting inside of containers? And the answer from Ben boiled down to, you know, any workload that you can put in containers, any new workload today should go in a container unless it requires a GUI, because containers are designed to be headless, right? Or it requires an older version of Windows that is not supported inside of a containerized environment. And that, in both of those cases, you would go the VM route. So that really kind of struck me as interesting that, you know, the methodology is to go with all new deployments as containers. Now, I know there's some, you know, there's still some issues with that. You know, a lot of the core Windows functions and features and roles are not supported inside of a container instance yet, but I know that Microsoft is working on correcting that. So, you know, what do you guys think, Thomas, Didier? What are your thoughts are on containers in the Microsoft ecosystem? Thomas, let's start with you.
Yeah, so yeah, it's funny because as I remember, like I think we had the same webinar last year, the three of us, when we were talking about Docker and what's happening in the container space and things like that. And I think someone of us, I cannot remember who was bringing up that containers are that fast speed that they probably get obsolete in a while and things like that. I'm not saying that they are right now and they're going to be soon. But just it was a funny thing which I just remembered. My opinion, so yeah, just briefly touch on the one point that was like application compatibility. Yeah, Microsoft introduced a new container image. They had already Nano Server as a container image and Windows Server Core, which they highly improved in terms of size and startup speed. But at Build, they also announced a new image. Today they call it just Windows, I think. And as you said, with that, they bring more compatibility to the Windows containers. So things which do not run usually on a Windows Server Core, they can probably run on that Nano Server image, on that container image. And the other thing I want to talk about, like, what workloads do you want to run inside a container? And I agree that if you have current applications and things like that, and or you're going to in some cases it can make sense to move everything in a container. I would challenge that in terms of, if I would develop a new application, would I really go for a container-based application, or would I not just use PaaS or serverless to do that, and don't even have that that overhead of the, like in a bad way, meaning that in a bad way, that overhead of a container around it. That overhead, obviously, as you mentioned before, Andy, it does also give you a little bit of flexibility. It's not all that bad. It gives you, for example, in a multi-cloud environment where you can like if you have workloads, if you want to be able to run workloads in different cloud or different cloud vendors, that's great. But I'm still would challenge that and ask people, what is the value of putting a container around something when you just can use a PaaS service, which is probably much easier to use, much less overhead, and much less OPEX, if you will. Why not do that?
Yeah, I'll add to that. What I'm seeing with developers, and they come in all sorts and size and shapes and preferences. So some developers love them. Some developers aren't too enthusiastic about the plumbing. They would love to hand over the plumbing to the infrastructure guys, but when you start doing containers, the boundary isn't as clear anymore as it used to be with virtual machines, for example. So that sometimes is a bit of a challenge. On the other hand, I think containers will be very important depending on where you are in the industry. Thomas mentioned microservices and serverless. If I recollect correctly, Azure serverless at the moment is leveraging VMs under the hood. That's not your problem. You shouldn't mind as long as you can do what you need to do. I'm pretty sure somewhere in the future, Microsoft will give us a nice little blog post. Hey, we're now using containers under the hood. But from a developer perspective, even you're using serverless or PaaS or microservices, you don't care. It's been abstracted away. So I think for a lot of developers, that container phase will be interesting. It's good to know about it, but it will be abstracted away. It's good that a developer knows about memory and CPUs, but he isn't constantly thinking about those things when he's developing code. That's been abstracted away for him partially. He just needs to be aware of certain things. So I think if you're Google, Microsoft, Amazon, you'll most certainly care about containers. I think if you perhaps develop an online service, a PaaS platform or a SaaS platform, you might care a lot about containers for the scalability, the speed, all that sort of things. But it all depends. And I'm not convinced that you should develop every application in a container today. Of course, if I was selling containers, I would think that's a great idea. But there are so many choices, and you need to really think about what choice is best for me, and don't just chase every new technology in the cloud without thinking about it, because it evolves pretty fast, and that means that the time you have to get it going in production and leverage it to do something useful and beneficial, that means profit for your company, also shrinks because things change so fast. So don't just jump from new technology to new technology without a plan. It might be wise even to skip some technologies if you don't really need them. There's no shame in that, right? If you can build your company completely on containers, that's fine. If you can say, I don't care, I'm building serverless and they might use containers under the hood, I don't care, that's also fine. So
yeah, that's great insight. I think that's really important what you said there. If you're not utilizing like the latest, bleeding edge technology, there's no shame in that, right? And I think that's great insight as long as they're not submitting themselves to technology debt, right? And I mean, there's a way to toe that line, right? I mean, you can stay reasonably up to date, but not be on the bleeding edge, right? It's certainly possible.
But you can run Windows Server 2019, be at the best level of the game you can be when it comes to a server operating system.
Right. Yep.
That's not technology debt. That's just, let's say, a mature age technology in contrast to serverless or containers. It doesn't mean it's technology debt. It's just not the most current, most recent thing on the block.
Yep, makes sense. Well, the next area I want to move on to here is to answer the question of how do IT pros get there. So one of the things that I've noticed that there's been a lot of focus on recently with Windows Server 2019 technical preview is the enhancement of in-place upgrades. Now, most of the IT pros that I know of, and me personally, I mean, I've historically said in-place upgrade, nah, no thanks. I'll deploy brand new fresh install and I'll migrate the services, right? That's what I've always historically done. But I know there's been a big push to make in-place upgrades a bit easier. I don't know, have you guys done any testing with the new in-place upgrade features and functionality in 2019? I know I haven't had a chance to get my hands on it yet, but I don't know if you guys have.
I'm actually a big fan of in-place upgrades because we all like to treat our service as cattle.
Right.
But I see a lot of holy cows out there in the real world, so sometimes it's important to be able to do an in-place upgrade, a bit more than you would love to see actually. But I'll confess, every 2016 cluster I am running in production now has been in place upgraded via rolling cluster upgrades from 2012 R2.
Nice.
Every single one. And I did that on purpose because I tested it out. It worked. Then I went into production. I always had a way out. Of course, you always make sure you can do that, but I did it. And I gave the feedback to Microsoft. You're at the best level of in-place upgrades you've ever been. But I still have some questions and requests for you, which they seem to be taken care of in this version. And this is important to them because, as we said, it's fine to still run a Windows server. No shame on you, but you have to stay current. And the cycle is speeding up. So they have to have their people, their customers, they have to give them the ability to keep up. In-place upgrades is one of those tools you might have to help them keep up. Right? Yep. You don't have to destroy a cluster anymore. You don't have to destroy the team anymore. If you do not, all that sort of stuff that is coming, that is enhancing your ability to just move as fast as possible. And some purists will say, no, you should always be able to start everything from scratch, which is fine if you can. But then there is reality. And I must say, I've only done it in environments where I have complete control over and I know the environment. So I will never walk into a 5-year-old infrastructure and without even looking or investigating the environment, we'll say, oh, we'll just hit upgrade and everything will be fine. I'm not that confident. I want to have some control over that.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I think that rolling upgrade process certainly made things easier, definitely. And it's good to see the increased focus on that area to allow people to do those in-place upgrades. Because like you said, you wouldn't walk into a 5-year-old environment knowing nothing about it and just hit upgrade. You know, I mean that's not smart.
I did not say that.
But yeah, definitely, it's good to see the new features on assisting people staying current and keeping that technology dead away. Definitely. So. Well, I think it's time for us to move on to our next major talking point. Just a reminder to people, if you have any questions or comments, be sure to get them into the questions form and we'll answer them as they're relevant to the discussion and if we have time for them. So the next thing I want to talk about is kind of this idea of new age management with Windows Admin Center. So again, if you haven't been watching the news really closely, this was previously called Project Honolulu. And it's a web-based management utility that's supposed to provide a lot of the same functionality and upgraded functionality of the RSAT tools. Now, we've had the RSAT tools for a long, long time, and they're still sticking around to my understanding, but Windows Admin Center, like I said, web-based utility, allowing you to manage your Windows infrastructure from Mac, Linux, Windows, all via a web browser, and it's really effective too. I mean, I've been testing a little bit inside of my lab and doing some tinkering with it, and I mean, it's responsive, it's intuitive, and it gets you the information you're looking for in a ready fashion. And we'll talk about extensibility a little bit later, but the extensibility aspect of Admin Center is just absolutely huge. The idea of being able to manage third-party applications via Admin Center, the same portal that I'm using for managing my infrastructure, is huge to me. So this new management experience is really, really enticing to me because, if I have my private cloud infrastructure, maybe I'm managing another cloud over here somewhere at a co-location, a service provider data center, I've got the single portal to manage all that, right? And that's one of my favorite things about it. So I don't know, what is your guys' feeling on this a little bit? Have you tested it out at all? Thomas, let's start with you, my friend.
Yeah, so I was very early on in the Project Honolulu phase involved, and I could have like early previews on it, and we used it heavily, for testing purposes, to make sure that like the features are in there which we need and things like that. And I like it. I really like it. It helps, and it makes administration of servers much easier. You have now that central point. You can like basically use every device to manage your servers from everywhere, right? Which is absolutely great. And it's kind of like, I mean, it came back from this, I think it was called the server management tools hosted in Azure. And already I liked those as well, right? But customers seem to want the version which is on premise, available without the need of Azure. That's absolutely fine. The biggest thing, though, I think is, well, the biggest thing which makes it a really good tool is the extensibility. Giving partners like hardware vendors, OEMs, and other software vendors the capability to integrate in that management tool is great. And I can already see from some OEMs, they're integrating their tools, their management tools. So whatever you do when you manage servers, doesn't really matter if you want to do interactive with the hardware, like BMC stuff, or if you want to go to the hypervisor level or VM level, manage inside a VM. Everything is in a single portal, right? And I think that makes it great that they have such a great, if they pull it through and build a great ecosystem with a lot of third-party vendors and tools, I think that will make the Windows Admin Center one of the best management tools for servers in the future.
Yep. I agree with that completely. I must say, we've been in this industry for quite a while, and for me, it's become almost second nature to use 25 tools to get my job done. I don't even think about it anymore. But newbies into the industry are like, where do I need to go for this one? I'm like, what? Isn't this obvious? Well, apparently not. And a tool that can help with that is fine, is very good, very welcome. And also the fact that this industry, in terms of the options and choices you have now and permutations of solutions you're getting, becomes ever bigger and bigger. So building separate tools for that might not be the best approach. So in that respect, it's very welcome. And as Thomas said, if Microsoft does this well, this could be the big breakthrough they've been aiming for. Because I remember some past attempts to replace some of the RSAT tools like Active Directory Administrative Center, that never went anywhere in the end. So, but now they're taking a more holistic view and they're going all the way for everybody. So I think that's good. The fact that it's web-based, that you can connect to your on-premises stuff, that you can connect to your cloud stuff, it's very promising. It's also a model that's a lot easier to update. So I think moving ahead, I think it's going to be more and more and more important, which doesn't mean that the RSAT tools will go away just like that. You will see a shift and a long-term transition, because you cannot expect, again, that a new product from day one will be 100% feature complete with everything you ever had in any other tool. You would like that, but it's a bit demanding,
Right. Yeah, makes sense. Well, before we move on, the two questions I want to make sure we answer here is, who is this technology for and how do IT pros get there? And to me, this is for anyone who's managing a Windows environment, right? I mean, that's kind of where this tool falls. And from a how do you get there route, I mean, this tool is available to go download today. I mean, you can download it, install it on your management machine or whatever you use as your daily driver. Yep. So, I mean, it's really easy to go out there, download it, install it. It's a very simple install and just start using it. I mean, when this thing was still Project Honolulu, that's when I downloaded it, and I just started using it to do my daily management tasks. I mean, just start using it a little bit, and eventually you're going to find that you'll be using it more and more and more. So, I mean, that would be my suggestion. I don't know if you guys have any other thoughts on that.
Yep, sounds like a very good approach. My first install was on my workstation at home. And I just started doing stuff in it and comparing it. Is this better? Is something missing? What do you want to do? What do I need? And then you can give some feedback. It's a risk-free way to test something out, and then you can deploy it at work for certain workloads. It's always a bit, depending on where you work. Do you want to install something that's not released yet officially, right? So something to keep in mind. But overall, the experience has been good, and I think it's only going to grow. Yeah.
Definitely. Well, I think we should move on to our next major area of discussion. So we spent all the time so far kind of in that private cloud space, right? Your infrastructure on-prem, and working with that stuff, right? So now let's start getting into more of the hybrid game here. So, this would fall into the category of you're going to have some stuff on premises, maybe some stuff in a co-location, maybe some in the public cloud. A lot of deployments are starting to fall inside of this category here. And the one key piece of technology that I really wanted to touch base on in this particular section is Azure Stack. So the concept of having, all of the bells and whistles and all the great stuff that Microsoft has figured out with Azure, they're packaging that up inside of Azure Stack and providing it for people inside of their data centers. Now, Thomas, I know you are a huge advocate of Azure Stack. Can you spend a little bit of time telling our attendees a little bit more about Azure Stack and kind of where it fits and who should be using it?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. I mean, I dealt with like very early stages already with Azure Stack. I had the opportunity to be part of one of the 20 first customers worldwide who could test it out. So we made our experience a little bit. So what Azure Stack really is, in like really quickly, Azure Stack is an extension of Azure. It is an appliance-based approach where you put an appliance in it and it allows you to run Azure services in your data center or in your location you want to have it, right? And so there are like three big use cases I see, which or Microsoft also identifies as the use cases for Azure Stack. And the first one would be, I would call that the technology challenges, right? So wherever you are and you have bad or no internet connectivity, and you want to leverage cloud services, you might be not so happy with the public cloud. So bringing those Azure services closer to you, or those cloud services closer to you, and where you don't have to connect over the internet in a disconnected mode or sometimes partially disconnected mode, it's great. It allows you to run the same services and consistently available in Azure on your side. It is also great for applications which have which cannot deal with large latencies. Even like we had the discussion before, 10 milliseconds can be already too much for certain applications. And if you connect to the public cloud, usually you deal with much more latency than this. So basically what Azure Stack allows you to do is basically sitting next to your cloud, right? The other two use cases are also very interesting. The first one is obviously regulatory reasons. So I come from Switzerland, and I know that a lot of other countries have those regulatories as well. They can be from the government, they can be industry regulations, or even internal ones, right? So there are always companies who say, okay, I don't want to have my data outside of my data center or even outside of my country, right? And that's absolutely a fair point, and Azure Stack allows you to run those services in places where there is no Azure data center available, with the conditions which are right for you. And the third option I would say is for companies which want to go to the cloud, which are not there yet. They, for example, do not really have all the contracts, all the governance in place to run on cloud services, but they already want to start in a technology way, starting applications on PaaS services, for example, or in a cloud way, and make their learnings, and Azure Stack can deliver on that. So that are the main three scenarios in terms of where would I use an Azure Stack. And the other thing I also want to mention, I mentioned that this is an appliance. It comes as a solution, right? It's not something you can download and install, except for if you want to try it out. And I have a great quote there from Jeffrey Snower. So he said, Azure Stack is for people who don't want to build a cloud. It's for people who want to run a cloud, right? It's not about building a cloud. It's about using the cloud as itself, and the services on top of it.
Yeah, consuming the cloud.
Exactly.
Yeah,
because I would advise nobody to build one.
Right. That's a great point. You think about all the different pieces and components required to build your own cloud. I mean, just think about all the different stuff. I mean, even if you get it to the point to where it's usable, right? Okay, well, that NIC driver needs an update now. Okay, now you have to deploy it. Okay, of the hard drives that you use, there's new firmware for them. Now you have to patch everything. I mean,
Well,
just the
yeah.
logistics around
Well,
that are, you
let's
know,
let's
this is
let's
something
face
that
it.
I don't want to deal with. I want
That's
to,
perhaps yeah.
yeah.
That's
I
perhaps
mean,
something that most IT pros have mastered, that skill level, let's put it that way.
right.
But there is, of course, a reason why Azure Stack comes as an appliance. I always say that the Achilles heel of software-defined anything is hardware. It sounds a
Right.
bit contradictory, but it is,
It is,
right?
yeah.
Software vendors have learned that hardware matters. Finally. uh, the problem with building a cloud goes far beyond that, because for me that's, unless you have really incompatible hardware with very lousy drivers, surmountable. But the entire overhead of building a cloud, that service model, that self-service model, creating resources, destroying resources, auto-scaling resources, that's where the really heavy lifting of building a cloud comes in.
Yeah.
And that is perhaps even a way better reason even to stay away from building your own cloud, unless you are a player like Microsoft, Google, Amazon. If you can leverage those budgets and those economies of scale, sure, give it a go, right? I mean,
Right.
it's a free market. Make it better and people will buy your stuff. But I think for the very vast majority of people and companies, even the big ones, it's not something they should focus on.
Right. I think that's a good point. I mean, I come personally, I come from a service provider background. I spent 11, 12 years working in the service provider space. And to me, maintaining and managing your own cloud is taking away from what you're really there to do at the end of the day. At the end of the day, you're there to service your customers, provide your customers technology in order to do their business. Now, an interesting use case I could see for Azure Stack would be for a service provider or a hoster to put it in their data center, and instead of managing it and manually spinning up resources inside of that cloud infrastructure for their customers, they instead say, hey, Mr. Customer, you want to spin up workload X inside of our infrastructure? That's great. Here's a web portal that you can go to, and you can do that at your leisure, and we'll just collect the bill at the end of the month. If I'm a service provider, that's level of hands off sounds really enticing to me. I mean, to me, that sounds like a great application for Azure Stack.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, just to extend on that, I absolutely agree with what you just said, and it's like generating value, right? At the end, just generating creating an infrastructure or managing an infrastructure does not really generate value for the company or for the customer. At the end, there are better things you should take care about, right? And if you go today to any cloud provider, you can spin up virtual machines in seconds or minutes, and you're happy with that. And this is not where the value comes from. So I see a lot of service providers have to, and system integrators and other companies have to go through and become like a managed service provider, because at the end, there are reasons why a workload runs at a specific location, but at the end it doesn't really matter. So if you can just manage and add some value to the services the customer needs as a service provider, then you can run it in Azure or in Azure Stack or whatever.
Right.
But you take care of it and you manage those workloads, right? And then that becomes more interesting than just providing physical infrastructure. And the best example, or I always come up with that when I talk to service providers, like Rackspace, right? They were one of the largest infrastructure service providers in the world, and even they already gave up on that more or less a couple of years ago, and they said we cannot compete with AWS or Azure. And we don't want that. That's not where we can generate value. And they become a managed service provider. And today they offer like different clouds from different vendors, and they take care of your applications, right?
Yeah. In my neck of the woods, I've seen a bit of lackluster enthusiasm for Azure Stack by those players, because they don't think they can add enough value or have enough profit from it. But in the end, if that's the model that is gaining traction, whether it's public cloud or private cloud. That's what people are going to do. And if you don't provide it, well, I'll just ask for Colo and put it in there and have it anyway. I want my cookie and I'll eat it, basically.
Yeah.
And they better think about that one. On the other hand, sometimes it's a bit schizophrenic, because I do see some of those people trying to position themselves as we'll manage your public cloud for you in Azure or in AWS. We'll be the go-between. And I'm like, what's the difference? Why do you want to have your own build model in a data center, whilst actually you could do the same with Azure Stack as you do or trying to offer in AWS? I mean, there's a lot of politics involved as well.
Right.
I think something was built, somebody paid for it, and perhaps it hasn't been written off yet, so it still needs to, be kept around a bit longer, or too long, maybe even. Yeah. But I definitely see a market for it. And again, as with anything in the cloud is a very vast and broad subject. You
Right.
don't really need to use every single piece of it. So if you decide that Azure Stack is not for you, it's fine.
Gotcha. Well, hey, we are about out of time for this particular section. There's one real quick thing I wanted to wrap up, though. How do IT pros get there? Thomas, can you elaborate how people can get started with Azure Stack real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. So I give you the 20 or 30 seconds pitch on what you should do. First of all, if you're not familiar with Azure today, or haven't used Azure today, or don't have Azure account, first thing you do, get an Azure account and start playing with it. There are some free credits, and you can start using Azure and understanding what's going on. I mean, that's going to be important. The second thing is there is some great course out there which covers the Azure Stack, how it operates, and it is with videos and assessments and text, and so you get through all kinds of things you need for Azure Stack, and it's free. I think it's hosted on EDX, and it's from support from Microsoft, and updated also regularly with new features. And then the third thing I would recommend, if you're really familiar a little bit with Azure Stack, probably you already run an Azure Stack, then go take the exam, the hybrid cloud exam, or study for that, and you will get the latest and greatest information about that. What I also can recommend is you can download the Azure Stack development kit and install it on your physical box and play around with it. So you can get some experience before purchasing a multi-node system, right? And then you can figure out if that really fits, if that's the thing you really want.
Sounds good. All right, thank you, Thomas. Now we'll move on to the last section here. Spend just a couple minutes on this. So again, we've talked about private clouds, we've talked about hybrid clouds. Now let's talk about public Azure, the public cloud, and some of the first steps that you can take to start utilizing some of the technologies in public Azure. So when I start talking about people transitioning over into public cloud, the area that I always focus on for newbies in the space is Azure IaaS. Because when you compare it with what we've had on premises for years, Azure IaaS is probably the thing inside of Azure that is closest in architecture to what we've been using. Basically, what you're doing in Azure IaaS is you're just spinning up virtual machines. You have full access to the operating system. You can install your applications on there. You can manage firewall rules for said virtual machine, give it a public IP address. I mean, basically everything that you've been doing on premises, you can do with Azure IaaS. So I often use that as like a good starting point for people that are just getting started with the public cloud. So that would be my advice as far as who this technology is for. If you're interested in getting started with Azure, what I would do is I would identify a few key workloads inside of your infrastructure, whether that is a simple web app, or maybe some storage, or something like that, something that's easy and has low impact on your production systems. Start with that as a first step. That would often be my my suggestion. Didier, Thomas, I don't know if you guys have any other suggestions there.
Personally, I started doing my own private stuff in the cloud first in IaaS.
Yeah.
I have an on-premises lab. I have now an Azure lab, and it's extended. I have a VPN to Azure. I got myself a little router that could do that. I extended my AD. I started playing with ADFS, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Then that's playing. That's really playing. That's things you shut down. Then when I was a bit comfortable, I moved my blog to Azure. It's important enough for me to care and do it well. It's not important enough to run a huge risk. So you get acquainted with all the technologies, and you start looking beyond that, and you start looking at what's missing, what's there. And that's one of the things you also have to keep in mind when starting to evaluate and look at things. Things move very fast in the cloud. If you think like this is not for me 6 months ago, you might have to look again right now to see if what was missing and was the deal breaker isn't there. But start out easy. Start out in a play environment. Depending on what contracts you have in Microsoft, you might have some test dev subscriptions, possibly some MSDN benefits, free vouchers, whatever. Just start playing, like you did with computers, basically. Probably if you're a bit older, you started playing with them and you start getting comfortable. Nobody put you in charge of the entire company's infrastructure from day one.
Right.
Basically. So it's the same with the cloud. Don't do that.
I remember getting started on my old 486. That takes me back a little ways.
Yep.
So anyway, so yeah, that kind of comes back around to the discussion of what kind of workloads lend themselves really well. And we've actually got a question here from Enkit in the, hope I'm saying the name correctly, in the chat here. You know, they're planning on moving their DR to Azure. Can you please suggest something? DR is definitely something that you can look at for Azure, because I mean storage in Azure is so cheap. So you know, when I'm talking about backup and recovery, because again, Altera, we're a backup vendor, right? You know, Azure is a great place to send offsite backups to, because the storage is so cheap. So you know, what we have here at Altera is we can go directly to an Azure storage account as a backup target. So we don't need a virtual machine in Azure. All we need is that storage account and the connection string, and we can send offsite backups to it. You know, if you need some other options there's always stuff like Azure Site Recovery is something you might want to take a look at. There's a lot of different technologies woven into that feature, but it's definitely something you could look at for DR purposes. So.
Some tips on that. If you do DR in the cloud, it's like DR or whatever. Even if it's on-premises to on-premises, data center to data center, don't make any assumptions. Test it all out. It's actually surprisingly easy to get all your VMs into the cloud. It can be surprising to some people when they start or they try to connect to them and work against them. Test the scenario out on a small scale, end to end. Have all your bases covered. Networking, connectivity, latency, because getting the stuff into the cloud is the easy thing. Then consuming it and failing over and making sure that the company stays running might ask for a bit more attention than you might have expected.
Yep, definitely. Yep. Good advice there. All right, well, to answer the final question here of how do IT pros get there, you know, I would say it's exactly the same answer that Thomas gave with Azure Stack. I mean, just start using it. You know, Didier mentioned start moving some of your personal stuff over to Azure. You know, that's the best thing I can recommend as to how do you get there. Once you get a little bit more comfortable with it, then you can start having those conversations internally at your jobs about moving some more of your core workloads into Azure. So really, it's kind of a, you know, what I would call an incremental shift. You know, don't dive in head first, but move what makes sense today. And when you're comfortable with it, move a little bit more and a little bit more. And I think what you're going to find is eventually you're more in the cloud than you are on premises, right?
Yeah,
so I don't know if
and the moment you start doing IaaS, the next question will be, hey, when should I be using PaaS or serverless or microservices? Yep. So the questions just come, they flow naturally. The only hiccup I had in that process is I can do dumpster diving for on-premises stuff and build very nice labs where I only have to pay for the power consumption. When you move to the cloud, even when you're playing, it becomes an OpEx. And as I've said before, I've been the one where somebody's in front of my desk asking me where all that money went. And I say I was playing and it was necessary. I swear to God, but it's so visible now, you know. Yeah, that can be a bit of a challenge sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, That's when I tell people, always make sure if it's just test dev you're doing in Azure, make sure you configure auto shutdown, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's become a lot easier actually.
It has.
A highly requested feature.
Yep,
Yeah.
definitely.
And
Definitely.
sometimes you're gonna have to spend the money and eat that cost, and it becomes a lot more visible. Right? No more dumpster diving. You can.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
definitely.
so one thing I would to add here in that conversation, by the way, again, like my advice would be start small. Like as I get ready, as you guys said, and then in the company, if you have the uh, like the idea to move to the cloud, start small. Take something small and take it. And as Didier also said, like test it end to end, play it through. Have a look at everything you need to take a look at. Take something easy, something simple, because there's so much things around it. Like we talked about the financial part, but also governance and security, access rights, and all those things, which or even contract management. So many things around it which should take place. So don't take something hard or something difficult to move it to the cloud. Take something easy and something small. And start to see where the pitfalls are. I mean, that's what we really recommend. I've seen so many projects where they said we want to move everything in the cloud in the next couple of months, and it just gets so complex with technology, and it gets complex with all the other stuff. It's never going to happen that fast, right? I mean, there are certain projects that can really pull that off, but usually just start small and iterate very fast and go forward very fast. I think that's the best way to approach those projects.
Yeah, that's good advice. So with that, I want to give people a second to get their final questions in here. So again, feel free to use the questions form to get your final questions in here. And while you do that, I'm just going to talk about our latest version of Altero VM Backup really quick. So again, we focus on a couple of key things here at Altero, efficient backup setup. But with ease of use and efficiency, a lot of guys think that means loss of features, but that's not the case with us. We provide full, powerful, flexible features with our application. Another area that I always like to highlight is our support team. Our support team, I have nothing but great things to say. We don't do tiered support here at Altero. You won't be holding an escalation queues or anything. When you call our support team, you get an answer quickly, and that person owns your issue from start to finish. And then from there, a couple of the new features that we have are we can, like I mentioned earlier, we can back up directly to an Azure storage account. And we also now have a feature called continuous data protection, which instead of having, a couple of hour RTO or maybe a 24 hours RTO, we can shrink down to as much as 5-minute RTOs, assuming that your infrastructure can handle it, right? So that's one of the great features that we have out there in the newer version. Now, I was planning on doing a demo, but we're a little short on time, and I want to make sure we get to your questions. So I'm just going to skip over to the final Q&A here. So I saw a couple of great questions come through here, and one that I wanted to touch base on was rough costs for storage in Azure. Storage is just super cheap in Azure. I don't remember the exact cost off the top of my head. And there's a couple of different tiers. You've got a hot tier of storage, and you have some cold tier stuff too that's more intended for like archival workloads, something that you're going to shove into Azure storage and not touch for a long period of time. But if I remember correctly, for the hot tier storage, you were looking at something like 2 cents a gig, if I remember correctly. I don't know if you guys have looked more recently than I have. It's been a while for me.
Basically, I'm going to quote a fellow MVP of us on this one. How much does a car cost? Depends on what car you need.
Right, exactly.
It's
exactly.
Like, what does storage cost? I mean, it depends on what you need, what your requirements are. And the good thing about cloud is that it's a lot easier to cherry pick the storage for the need you have.
Right.
On premises, you would have to buy a diverse a system that can do it all, or multiple systems that can do it all. So in the cloud, it's all there, and you just cherry pick what you need where and when. So, but asking how much something costs in the cloud is a bit of an open-ended question, I must say.
Right.
It's very hard to answer. You'll have to look at your use cases. But the good news is storage is probably one of the cheapest elements in the cloud unless you go for the really high-end stuff, but then it's expensive on premises as well.
Right, definitely. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Another question here that we had from a good friend of ours, Alessandro Cardoso. He was an MVP previously, but he's gone to work for Microsoft now, I think, hasn't he? Yeah.
I think so, yeah.
But
Pretty sure
one talking, what's that?
Pretty sure about it, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, one thing that he brought up that I think is an interesting point is, what about GDPR? How does GDPR fit into this whole concept of cloud migration? Now, I mean, I'm not a lawyer by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not going to pretend I'm a lawyer, but I do know that I've seen just a ton of documentation out there from Microsoft on being GDPR compliant. I mean, just about every company out there has released some sort of statement. I mean, I saw a meme flow through my Facebook feed one day of, there was a lady walking down the street with her ears covered, and there was a guy walking behind her with a trumpet, like right behind her head, and the trumpet was labeled GDPR, because you keep getting all those flood of email, right? But my point is there's documentation out there on Microsoft's website, I know, that addresses that. But how about you guys? Have you run across anything, any insight to share as far as GDPR is concerned?
GDPR for us has not been any more of an issue due to the cloud or not. I mean, it's something you have to be compliant with, basically. Now, the good news is if Microsoft, Azure, or AWS for that matter, if they take care of the GDPR compliancy of the entire stack that is needed to build the cloud, then what you need to worry about is what you do with it and in it. Right? If you keep personal identifiable records of people, of your customers, on a database on premises or in SQL Pass, you're responsible for the fact that that is well protected. Well, the infrastructure side of protecting the PaaS infrastructure, that's Microsoft taking care of that for you.
Right.
If you, of course, open up that database to the entire world anonymously and allow every hacker to query it, that's your responsibility. But you have that responsibility on premises as in the cloud. So from that perspective, it's no different. GDPR is a reality, just like other regulations. It's just a new added regulation, specifically for privacy about personal information. Let's put it that way. I'm no lawyer either, but from a pure technology perspective, it doesn't cause me any more headaches because it's the cloud.
Right.
Potentially, I always say, well, I'm pretty good at my job. I can run a pretty decent, mean, lean infrastructure that's well protected, but I'm no match for the 20,000 engineers on Microsoft Azure, I'm afraid.
Yeah. You and me both.
I'm just being modest, of course, but
Right. Well, gents, I think we have time for one more question real quick. We had this one come in earlier, and I wanted to make sure we addressed it. More of a use case question. So we have Mike in the chat here asked about, he's got 3 North American offices, all with their own in-house file server. One of the small offices has 6 users that are going to be moving to a home office setup. So going to a, more of a disaggregated setup with remote users instead. So the thought was to move the file server to the cloud as a good test for the company eventually moving that route. They're kind of wondering what steps they would take to get there. So my advice would be to look at maybe OneDrive for Business and Office 365, or maybe even Azure Files as a possible solution to that. What are your guys' thoughts on that?
If you have a need for a file server, and I might insult some people who think that everything can be solved with, let's say, SharePoint Online and OneDrive, I can most definitely tell you from experience you cannot. So if you still have a real use case for a file server, it's not a good idea to move that to the cloud and then hand it out to private users at home. That is not a very good model, in my opinion. However, if you have those small locations still active and they still have a file server, Azure File Sync is one of the new technologies that's being introduced and going GA relatively soon, where you really have to take a look at. It's one of the best, let's say, hybrid cloud solutions for files that I've seen in many years. I'm pretty enthusiastic about it and looking at it myself. But when it comes to individual users, you're absolutely right. I'm guessing then that those are not the users that will be perhaps having that requirement to have other files available at home than Office files or knowledge worker files? If they do, there is another solution, and that is perhaps have them connect RDP into a VDI solution in the cloud itself. So your workstation is close to the data, and you avoid all those issues from latency and file sharing over the internet and whatever not.
Yeah, that's great insight. So, all right, well, I think we're over on time here, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Let them get back to their day. Didier, Thomas, I want to say thanks, guys, for taking the time to come and chat today. It's been great having you on the show as always. We're always thankful for your insights, so really appreciate you guys coming on.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, and again, I want to say thanks to all the attendees. Hope that this webinar has been very helpful for you. We've got some additional resources here on the screen here. And again, we always do a follow-up blog post regarding these webinars, with a full list of the questions and their associated answers, and some additional insight from the show as well. We've had a lot of great comments, a lot of great opinions shared. So I'll be sure to include that in the blog post as well. So again, thanks for attending. We love doing these things for you guys, and we hope to see you again for another Altera webinar in the future. So thanks for watching. Have a great day.